Once again, welcome everyone to Dr. Jasper. Session has begun. I just wanted to get started because we have, let me get back in the doctor's office here. We have a lot to get through in today's session. We'll be talking about pre-authenticated tokens and single sign-on in Jaspersoft. Real quick, just to start, a couple of housekeeping things. If you have questions, please, we love questions. Please ask questions. Do so using the Q&A button in your Zoom link. It should be, I think, down at the bottom of your Zoom window. And we will get to those questions at the end of the session. So go ahead and ask all the questions you want there, and we will get to them. We will try to get to all of the questions that we can at the end of the session. So we will get started. My name is Mike Bilkowitz, running the Dr. Jasper session this month. And like I said, we're doing the pre-authenticated token, talking about SSO in Jaspersoft. We're going to just a quick look at the agenda. We're going to talk about what exactly is single sign-on, how does Jaspersoft handle it, what types of SSO do we support, and then I'll give you a quick definition of a pre-authenticated token, what exactly we're looking for in Jaspersoft, and then we'll jump right into the demo and I'll show you kind of how to do it and how easy it can be to implement. All right, we'll get started. So single sign-on obviously refers to the ability for users to sign on to just one time to access multiple applications. Right? Generally, it's done by your application. When a user wants to access another application like Jaspersoft, then they don't have to sign on again. So somehow those credentials have to pass from the calling application to Jaspersoft in this case. The way Jaspersoft works is we actually must maintain that user information for things to work in our system. So we have a repository, which is like an internal database where the user data has to live, and certain functionality that we do in Jaspersoft relies on that information, like access permissions to what reports someone can see, or maybe data filtering that you've applied to a domain or an ad hoc view or a studio-based report, and so on. So we need to get that data across to Jaspersoft in some way. So we do have a lot of different types of single sign-on that Jaspersoft can support. Most of them are a little more advanced than what we're going to talk about today, but then we have LDAP, it's like AD, CAS, SAML, OAuth, and then of course we're going to talk about pre-authenticated tokens today. We even have the ways, I mean, we can pretty much customize anything. So any system that you have, we could actually customize, but they get a lot more advanced once you start talking about those other methodologies. So to keep it light today, we're going to talk about pre-authenticated tokens. And what do we mean by that? A pre-authenticated token is a token of data that is necessary for Jaspersoft to create and or sync the user in our system. And usually it's passed via the URL, or some people choose to pass it via the header when you make the request to Jaspersoft. Of course, the data that you're passing in should be encrypted. What examples I'm going to show you today, I will be using unencrypted data, but I'll try to give you a little sample of how it would work if you send that data encrypted. Or, as you see there, you could possibly obfuscate the data by other means, and we'll dig into that a little bit later on as well. So there's other ways to get really secure, depending on how secure you want to get. So what happens in Jaspersoft with single sign-on? So I put together this little flow chart just so you can see the token gets passed to Jasper. The first question gets asked by our system: does the organization that you pass exist already in Jaspersoft? If it doesn't, then it gets created. Then we check to see if the user exists in Jaspersoft. If it doesn't, then he gets created, the user gets created. And then if he does exist, or once the user is created, we then sync the user details with roles, orgs, membership, profile attributes. Well, sorry, profile attributes are the next step. So then once the user details have been synced, we check to see, did you actually pass profile attributes? If so, Then we add those profile attributes to the user. It's a separate step because the way our system works, you can't assign profile attributes to users unless the user is already created within JasperSoft. So that's kind of an extra step in the process, and you'll see how that works here in a moment. Once that's all done, then the system logs the user into JasperSoft if everything was kind of valid and we were okay with it, and it sends them to whatever page you tried to hit in JasperSoft when you passed the token. It's fairly straightforward. It's just those multiple checks happen every time a user is sent with the token on the URL or in the header. So here's a nice slide I put together to show the definition of the tokens in Jasper and what we kind of expect. This is customizable, highly customizable. You can add to this as well if you want, but this is the basic elements that we include with or expect with every token. You've got the username, which will, and sorry, I should have put a title here, but this is the kind of the key that we're looking on the URL for. So we'd be u equals, and then whatever the username is that you want for the user in JasperSoft. R will be the role or roles. You can have multiple roles that the user should have. If you have multiples, delimit them with a comma. Any role that you pass this way by default in our system will get created at the organization level. So the roles are unique to each organization, which brings me on to the O, and that's the organization that the user will belong to. If you want to use sub-organizations and actual hierarchy in our sub-organizations, you do that with a comma-separated list. So your first org list would be the parent organization, comma, then you can have a sub-organization there, and you can go multiple levels there if you want as well. EXP is an optional field that if you want to add a little security to your request, you can do that by putting a date time format, which is defined in the XML file. We'll see that later, which is when the token that you're passing is actually supposed to expire. So that way the token expires after a certain amount of time. And then we have profile attributes. Profile attributes are a little bit more unique. PA1 to X, so PA1, PA2, PA3. You can have as many as you want. They do have to be defined in the XML file, but they will be then assigned to the user there. And again, we will see how that works here momentarily. Whoops, that's what I had. So generally, our key value pairs are passed on the URL, like I said, or in the header, and usually your identifier is PP. Again, you can choose what that actually is in the XML file when we get into that. PP stands for principal parameter. It's a Spring Framework terminology. You can change that PP to anything you want, but that's what the system will trigger off of to know, oh, this is a single sign-on request. I got to do stuff a little bit differently. Again, we will see how that works right now. So we actually ship with a bunch of configurations for different single sign-ons. Those of you that don't know, you can download the WAR file from, if you are an existing customer, the WAR file from our e-delivery site. And when you unzip that WAR file, you have the Build-O-Matic directory, which is where all the installation files are for JRS, but there's also a samples folder that comes with that. And inside that samples folder is this external auth sample config directory. And within there, you see a bunch of different XML files. The one we're going to focus on today, of course, is the pre-auth one here. That's the most common one I would say that clients use because it is relatively easy to implement and get running really quickly. CAS, LDAP, some of these other ones are a little more advanced and take a little bit more legwork to set up front. I did mention OAuth and SAML. We do not ship with sample XML files for OAuth and SAML because they are so complex and advanced. But if you Google JasperSoft and OAuth or JasperSoft and SAML, you'll get a nice wiki article that kind of walks you through how to set that up if you need help with that, or I mean, if you want to go that route. So to get your SSO implemented, it's quite simple up front. You can take this file and copy it over to your JasperSoft installation directory. So mine is actually in this JRS 750 directory. So I'm going to be working with 7.5 today. And in that, there are going to be web apps, Jasper Server Pro, WebInf. And you notice in this directory are a bunch of these application context files. These are all sorts of configuration files that tell JasperSoft system how to work and how to connect up with the actual code behind the scenes. So this file I copied over here and removed the sample dash prefix. You have to do that because the system is looking for all of these application context files when it starts up to parse out and pull all the data and put it into the JVM that gets started up. So let's take a look at this file. All right, so in this file is the definition of your single sign-on, how things are going to work. As I mentioned, one of your first things you have set is the principal parameter. That's the value we're looking for on the URL. So if you want to change that, this is where you would do so. If you don't like PP, you can change that to anything you want. We do specifically keep the identifiers short because sometimes you can come to the situation, especially if you have a lot of profile attributes, where your URLs can get too long for the browsers. So that's part of the reason we keep these really short if possible. I keep mentioning that we're looking at the URL for the token. By default, that's how the system is set up. There's a property right here, token in request param, and it's set to true by default. And you see by the comments here, if you have it set to true, we're only looking in the URL. If you set it to false, we're only going to look in the header, so it can't be passed in the URL. If you don't specify it at all, if you comment out this property, it will actually check both the header and the URL. So that's an important distinction to make. But again, by default, it's going to be checking our URL. The next important section I'm going to talk about, I'll chat about real quick, is the encryption method. I mentioned that you should actually encrypt your data that you send over the URL. So we have to have a way in Jaspersoft to decrypt that data. I will show you in more depth a little bit later how an example of how to do that. But that essentially entails you writing one Java class and implementing a method from this CipherEye interface that we provide, which is called decrypt. And that decrypt method takes in the token that's passed in via the URL or the header. You then decrypt it and then return back the plain text string to the rest of the system, and then it will process the token appropriately. So we'll talk more about that. We have it set up by default to work with plain text tokens only. So when I implemented this and put this into my 7.5 instance, it works immediately, but only for 7.5, I'm sorry, for unencrypted tokens. And again, we'll talk more about that later. The next section that you really care about is this block here. This block here defines those properties that I showed you in the slide before. So if you don't like U for username or R for roles, you can change that here. All right. You do not want to touch the key values here because that's something that our code is actually looking for. However, the values can change. And you can see we actually have an example. It's getting relatively old now because as you see, we reference U equals Obama. We have a token separator, which is a pipe. Some people have pipe values in some of their data, so that you may want to change that pipe to something else, like a percent or I don't know, an ampersand, or maybe not an ampersand because that's in URLs, but point is you can change that separator here. So then we pipe delimit that with all of our tokens. You can see here that Obama is going to get 2 roles, president and husband, and then his organization is going to be the White House. And then you've got profile attributes. The profile attributes are a little unique in that PA1 will map to whatever this key is here. These keys you can change and should change. So this is the value that you're going to see attached to the user inside of Jaspersoft once they get processed and synced. So right now we're going to see profile attrib 1 for whatever value we pass in for Obama. Assuming we passed in these 2 values, he'd get this comma separated list. And then profile attrib 2 will be set to Washington if we use that particular data. And then here is your expiry time as well, the EXP, and right below is a property that shows what timestamp format you should be in. So if you want to choose a different timestamp, if you do want to use that property, you can set that timestamp right here. Fairly straightforward. What's actually happening in this file? How does SSO really work? I showed you that flow chart of the process. Well, really what's happening is these processors that you see listed right here are what are actually getting executed in order to perform the actions you saw in the flow chart. The first one is the tenant setup processor that checks that organization information, make sure it exists in our system. The next one's the user setup processor that actually checks the user and then creates the user or syncs the user. And then if you have profile attributes, of course, you'll want this profile attribute processor. If you don't have profile attributes, you can comment out this processor, and that will help your performance very slightly. It doesn't take a lot, but you'll see here we have a comment that notes that. So if you don't expect profile attributes, go ahead and comment this out so we don't run it. The important thing to understand here is you can add any processors to the list here yourself. So if you are so inclined and you want to perform other actions in your single sign-on, by simply adding a reference to a processor being here, and you see we have an example one here that is commented out, which creates a folder for the user with their username as the name of the folder. So if I uncommented this guy and its definition down below, it would actually create user folders for me, which is really nice. You can do anything you want here as long as you write the code to do it. And how does that work? If I search for that external user processor, at the very bottom of my file, I have the bean definition, and it points to a Java class that we ship with in JasperSoft in this case, but it could be any Java class that you've written to get executed at this point. Now, how that actually works, you may want to look at some of our code, which we are open source, so you can download the code and take a look at it to see how it really processes, how a processor actually works. But that's definitely a more advanced topic for another time. There are a couple other settings here that I like to point out in this file. One, there's a list here for default internal roles. By default, it's set to role user. Please do not remove that. A user needs role _ user in our system to be able to operate. But if you wanted to add more, you can do that by simply adding to this list. So for some reason, you want every user to have a certain role in our system, you can add that right there, and it'll automatically add that to them. More commonly is this organizational role map setting here. This guy allows you to map roles in your system to internal roles defined already in JasperSoft. So the example they're giving here is you've got a role in your system called admin external organization. I doubt it would be called that, but whatever it's called, you can put that in here. And what do you want to map it to in JasperSoft? Well, we have a role, those of you that know the system, called role administrator, which gives the ability to administer users within an organization. So if you have special users like that and you don't call them role administrator in your system, you can map them right here. So you can do multiple mappings here if you'd like. So you just uncomment this guy and restart the service. And remember, any changes to any of the XML files in our system requires a server restart. So so keep that in mind when you're building the system. And that's it for this XML file. That's really it. There's other little details in here, but most of it you don't have to worry too much about. So once that file's dropped in and you restart the server, then that's it. That's it. Your plain text SSO should be implemented, and I'll show you an example of how to test that right now. So you can see here, I'm a super user. If I go in, this is the 7.5 interface. For those that haven't seen it, it has gotten quite a facelift since 7.2 and previous. And you can see my list of users here. These are the users that we just ship with, basic users, some admin users for that default organization. So pretty empty right now. But if I want, I'm going to show you, I've got some URLs set here. So let's say I want to create a test user, put him in a test org, which doesn't exist, give him a couple of roles, which also don't exist, and give him a couple of attribute values, okay? One thing I didn't note, anytime you send data like this across the URL, you got to be very careful, right? Because obviously the URL is expecting some equals signs in here, and if you have an equals in an equals, it will get very confused. So you have to encode your URL. All right, encoding is not the same as encrypting. All right, it's a little bit different, but there's online encoders if you're just trying to test it that you could just literally run this section through, and that's what I've done here. I took this guy, went to an online encoder, quickly encoded it. What that does is it replaces all the special characters with the ASCII codes. So you see equals gets replaced with %3D, pipe gets replaced with %7C, and so on and so forth. All right, so once I have the encoded URL, and you'll notice what I did is I took the home URL, right? So if I go home, this you see is my URL for my home page. So if I want to direct the user directly to my home page, once I pass the single sign-on token, that's the URL I want to use. If you want to pass them to the library, you would just go to the library and start with this guy. Okay, that's going to be your base URL. So whatever you want to direct them to, that's the URL you want to set here. So now I'm going to grab this whole URL. I'm going to log out as super user. And now without using the login page there, I'm literally going to go straight to this URL, passing that token. And because I have that XML file in place, it's going to say, oh, I've got the PP in there. So now I'm going to go through my SSO, and I have now been logged in as test user. And you can tell I'm a regular user, not a super user, because I don't have the admin section here. And there's no create button next to domains and data sources. I can view them, but I can't create them. So let's go verify this user. So I'm going to log back in as super user. Excuse me. And if I go manage users, you're going to see I now have a test user in here who's a member of the test org, which did not exist before. And he's got role user, because that was the default assigned to everybody, and the 2 roles that I passed on the URL. And he's got 2 profile attributes assigned to him, some attribute for profile attribute 1, and then I have a multi-attribute 1, multi-attribute 2 set for profile attribute 2. So if we look back again at this, you see PA1 with some attribute. PA1 in our XML file translates to profile attribute 1. So on the system, we got profile attribute 1 with some attribute. The other thing to note is when a user is defined with an SSO process like this, you will see this checkbox here you cannot change that says the user is defined externally. What does that mean? It means a couple things. It means that that user has to now always log in via the single sign-on, via the external method, all right? You cannot log in as this user via the login page. Partially because there's no password for the user. Second, because we want to make sure that the user data always stays synced to your system, to the calling system. So if I was to change the role for this user, all I have to do is pass that new role on the URL, and it will get updated here in the roles that are assigned, right? So if they were able to log in via the login screen, they could avoid any changes in your system. So that's why we disable that. Now, as super user, I can still emulate this user and say log in as user, but that's the only other way to log in with that user is if you're an admin or a super user, and you can hit this login as user here. So that's really important to understand. Let's see. Okay, so that is the real basic way to do it. Now, what happens if we want to encrypt that data and we have to write that code for that CipherEye interface? All right, I'm going to show you just a real quick example, a couple of examples, I think we have time, of the code and how it would work. So here's an example of something that one of our professional services people has written. So it's in this package com Jaspersoft PSSSO. Package doesn't matter, you name it any package you want. Name the class anything you want, but in this case, it's Cipher Impl. And you can see here, it's implementing this CipherEye interface. That means there are 2 methods that are defined in CipherEye. There's an encrypt method and a decrypt method. We don't care about the encrypt on the Jaspersoft side, right? Doesn't matter to us how it was encrypted. All we care about is decrypting that data. So what we had to do is actually implement this method here. And in this case, you get the encrypted text passed to you. So whatever was sent in the token, in the URL or in the header, is going to actually get passed into this method via this variable. So you can see we've got some stuff going on here. Whatever you need to do, whatever your decryption algorithm is, generally Jaspersoft doesn't write these because it's really up to you. You don't want us to know how you're doing your decryption, but this is an example of one I think we wrote for a client. And basically you can set your decryption type, you do all that work. Bottom line is, you know, there's a there's a parse here. It actually inits this guy, and then it does the actual decryption in here. And then what you want to do is once you've decrypted it, you return that from this decrypt method. And that's it. The rest of JasperSoft will then do its job, assuming that token looks like U equals whatever, pipe R equals whatever, etc. That's the most basic output there. Now, I also referenced the way to obfuscate the code or your data even beyond doing just normal encryption. A lot of our clients don't feel that this normal encryption is enough. So what they do is they come up with, we've come up with other ways to encrypt the data or to do something with the data. Well, a common example of that is we have the user, the client, before they make the call to JasperSoft, they actually write the data that they want to send to JasperSoft into a database, very small, lightweight database. Then they take some sort of randomly generated key that's the key on the database row, and pass that to us in the encrypted token or in the token. Doesn't have to be encrypted at that point. Who cares? So we get that value in here, and then we say, well, what do we want to do? So I've got this example of a custom database preprocessor, that is what I call it. It still implements the CipherI interface. And my decrypt method, rather than really decrypting any data, what it does is it takes that token that was sent over, and it actually gets the user details based on a connection to that database. So I actually am querying the database that the data was written to and saying, yeah, I've got this little lightweight database called Jasper Data. I can connect to that database, get the org name, the username, the roles, profile attributes, so on and so forth, and build the token based on the data in the database. And then I actually return that token there. So you would think that this would maybe be a performance issue. It's not. As long as you keep that database very lightweight and in good, relatively close, if you will, to your Jasper server. Sometimes people use the Jasper repository. Other times they use their own system, which you're already accessing for data. Bottom line is, this actually goes pretty quick. It's a really quick query. Give me the user based on the token that I've received. Restructure that data into a string, and then return it to the rest of JasperSoft in this format that we've talked about. So that's an additional method of security that you can do. And a lot of my clients that I've worked with have implemented something like this. I've had clients build web service calls in here that say, okay, here's my random token. Go out here, make a web service call, and I'll return you the Jasper data. That method sometimes is a little slower than the other methods, but it still works. Anything you can do in Java code, you can actually write as a hook. This decrypt method you could treat as a hook to actually execute that code and build. As long as you build that token, by the end, we don't really care what you did in here. It's up to you. So that shows you a little bit more in-depth method there of how you can do it. So I apologize. I know I was talking very fast. I went through stuff very quickly. Let's see real quick. Let's go back to the slide deck. And so I do have a few key prescriptions before we get into the Q&A. The most basic pre-auth SSO can be implemented by dropping that file in, just as you saw. To properly use it, of course, you should encrypt your token and implement the decrypt method in that CipherI interface. By the way, I didn't mention, once you have your implemented CipherI interface here, you know, depending on how you want to do it, you can, what I usually do is export your data into a jar file. And once you create your jar file, just drop it into your webinf lib directory. And that way, when the XML file comes in, it will know to where your code is. So in this case, it's com JasperSoft PS SSO. So what I would do is I would go to my XML file here, and I would replace this guy with the path to that class. So I would do this, and then I would grab the name. It's CipherImpl. So you got to make sure to reference the class that you built. So I apologize, I didn't mention that before. So this reference will only work if that class exists in the class path somewhere. So what we do is we generally put that in our webinf lib directory, which is where all the jar files live. in our system. And so all you got to do is drop it in there and it will get parsed properly. All right, JasperSoft SSO can perform a myriad of other activities on user login by adding custom processors like I showed you with that user folder processor to that flow in the XML file. Definitely a more advanced sort of topic there, but a lot of stuff can be done that way. You can also implement other forms of SSO, as I mentioned, see those sample files, and or contact your JasperSoft CS or PS professionals if you need further help. It's very common for us, obviously, to do SSO. A lot of you, I think, are existing clients and probably have a version of SSO out there. So, but so you know how it kind of works. But if you're new and you haven't, you're just thinking about Jasper right now, it's something that we do a lot with the time that you purchase with us, your upshift time, if you get to that point. So, now there is one other thing I did not mention. It's much more advanced, but you can add other properties that get passed on the URL and have them processed during your SSO process. It does require some code customizations. There is a link in the resources slide here. I'll try to put it in the chat window perhaps, but it's a wiki article that I wrote a while back that shows you how to actually do that. So if you want to add, let's say, email address or the actual organization name, I've done that for clients. Pretty much anything, there is a way to do that. So see the URL in the resources slide, which we'll get to in a second. So I don't think we have a ton of questions right now. Jake, are you on? Do we have any good questions we need to answer at this point?
Yeah, so we've got just one question in here, and I'm not sure what the correct answer is for it. But the question is it possible to share the custom DB processor that was mentioned?
So that processor, I don't mind sharing it with you. If you do want it, please email Dr Jasper at tibco.com. That will come to me and I can send it to you. The thing is, it's pretty genericized, so it's not referencing a table that actually exists. We just made a generic table in there. So it would be more for purposes of just to understand how it should work or could work. So I'm more than happy to share that though if you need it, but I don't want to send it out to everybody because it's big Java file. So definitely send me an email at drjasper@tibco.com and I'll get that to you. Absolutely.
Okay, and we've actually got a few more questions coming in over here. So Paul asks if they're running an Azure AD Office 365 and a user changes their password, how would this token system be implemented and how does it capture the password change automatically?
So we do not deal with passwords in single sign-on. That's why we check that box that says they're externally defined. So once your single sign-on method is implemented, the user data comes across, but passwords do not come across. We don't care about passwords. That's on your side completely. Remember, we're in this method, we're pre-authenticated token. So we're talking about you're already authenticated. I don't care what your password was. I don't care how you authenticated. You're then building a token in your application, sending that to JasperSoft. So the password does not matter. The other data is what's more important. If the roles change or what organization they're in or their profile attributes change, obviously then it's up to you to rebuild that token with the updated data, and then Jasper will sync that for you and update it. So passwords just don't matter when it comes to that. Now, if you've implemented a different type of SSO, I mean, none of our SSOs care about passwords, to be honest. So passwords shouldn't be an issue. What's next?
All right, so two more questions here, but I think it's kind of wrapped up into one. Again, this is probably going to be the same answer that we gave to the very first question, but just any other references that can be given for other types of authentication like SAML or LDAP?
Yeah, so the LDAP is probably one of the most common ones. If you look at that sample XML file that we ship with, let me share my screen again. So we've got this sample XML file here. If you take a look at that guy, it's actually very well commented. There is a section, I believe, in our security guide that actually discusses that. and we could try to get that out there. So in this guide here, in the XML file here, there's a lot of information in here about how to set up the user DNs and all that kind of stuff. It's a little bit different configuration than what I just showed you in the token. So LDAP, I would just reference the actual sample file. For what was the other one? SAML. Like I said, if you literally search Jaspersoft SAML, you will get a wiki article that was written. It may not be most up to date because we don't ship it with our product. It's something that one of my colleagues in customer success actually put together and tries to maintain, but we all have day jobs doing this stuff too, so it's hard for him to keep that up to date when we change spring versions. So definitely, if you have SAML questions, reach out to your customer success manager or your professional services folks if you've worked with that team for more assistance. So I think we've answered those. Anything else? I don't see anything. Are you seeing anything else? I think that's it. So please, thank you again for joining us. Our next session will be April 9th. Topic is still TBD. It's always the second Thursday of every month. So if this was your first time joining, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. If you were a repeat customer, we'd love to have you back. Thanks again. If you have questions in the future, like I said, or if you want that custom DB processor, please email Dr. Jasper at tibco.com, and that will come to me in this particular case, or whoever is monitoring that mailbox. And now, before I hang up, I just see there's more chats coming in.
Yeah, so it looks like we got one question here kind of wrapped up at the end. So it looks like this particular person, you've got about 500 quote unquote internal users who are accessing a handful of reports. You mentioned 5 here, and now you're talking about opening that up to external accounts, which is around 200,000 users. So the question more or less here, Mike, is just the safety incorporating SSO or any other mechanisms to solve that.
Yeah, if you just want to access or give them the access to the reports, yes, you can open SSO, but that'll create those 200,000 users as they log in into Jaspersoft. If it's only 5 reports, one thing to consider would be using our REST API or visualize.js to actually access those reports. You still need user information to access the report, but you could always create a service account if you wanted to that all the users would use just to access those 5 reports. It's not something I usually recommend. But it is possible to do that way. But it would not be a problem to incorporate SSO to allow those 200,000 users to access it. You just got to keep in mind the performance of the system if all of a sudden you're adding 200,000 users into Jaspersoft. So if the only thing they're using is accessing those 5 reports, maybe that's not a big deal, but it really depends on your performance and how much cores you have and how much the system can handle. So excellent. So if you have further questions, like I said, Dr. Jasper, tibco.com. Please join us again next month, April 9th. And thank you again for joining. That's all for today. You guys have a good day.